Hi, I'm Patricia Greenberg. One of the topics that I like to talk about, it's actually not just a topic, it's an entire era, and that's the baby boomers, the Vietnam generation. That is the age group that my husband falls into. I'm the tail end of the baby boomers. I'm what's called Generation Jones. But that time in history that we seem to be attached to forever and ever, and all the things that went on at that time, I still think needs a lot of attention and a lot of explaining. And I don't want anybody to forget what went on in those years. And having a very special affection for the men and women who served during the Vietnam War, I decided to really do a show today about this. I was a little too young to really understand what was going on then. I was 7 years old in 1968. And even today, there's just so much misinformation about how these young men approached their service to our country, and women. People forget there were women there serving in a wide variety of capacities, and how the government handled the war and where those surviving soldiers are today, both physically and emotionally. My guest today is Betty Prior. She's also known as BJ Elliot Prior, who had the distinct honor of working as a flight attendant for MAC operations. That's an acronym for Military Airlift Command, transporting soldiers to and from Vietnam from 1969 to 1971. She co-authored with Linda Lou Combs Wise a book that she has out now that was beautiful. I stayed up all night reading it, called Behind My Wings. Welcome, BJ and Linda.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
Yeah, honored to be here. Honored to speak about a subject that I love.
I hope that many of you are watching the YouTube, and for those who are just listening, Betty is as gorgeous now as she was in 1969. So when you see the pictures in the book and you see her today, she looks amazing. BJ, how did you start out becoming a flight attendant? That was the original trajectory of how you got to being in Vietnam. Yeah.
Actually, what happened in my life is I took my very first flight when I was 13 years old. And when I flew on that flight, it was a short flight, LA to Sacramento. I just knew right then and there that I wanted to work for the airlines. I didn't care where. I just fell in love with the aircraft and flying, and made my decision at 13.
Amazing.
And life, has its ways of carrying you through. So when I made the decision to try out for the airlines, I was 23 years old. And I had just been through a divorce. And the law in California at that time, you had to wait a year. So when I went and applied, they all asked me to wait until my divorce was final and then come back. And I did. And Continental was the best and the right airline. And I can explain that later, but it was perfect for me. So at 24 is when I started with the airlines.
And it's interesting to me, in those days, you weren't allowed to be married and be a flight attendant.
Correct. You had to be single, a certain height, a certain weight, couldn't wear glasses, and definitely could not have any children. So those were the parameters. And actually, they took our weight every month. And if you were over a few pounds, they removed you from the trip. So it was very strict.
Wow. And did they give you an opportunity to take those pounds off, or you were out?
You were out until you lost them.
Wow.
Come back. Yeah.
Now, Betty, at that time, did you feel violated?
Actually, I didn't have a problem with my weight. So no.
So maybe not personally, but I mean, as a policy, how did you feel about it?
Well, years later, we realized that there was the Discrimination Law Act that was passed in 1967, and they could not have held that. But we were so young, we didn't know. If they told us we were fired, and but a lot of gals got their jobs back, which was very good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I loved your opening. You went from air hostess to stewardess to flight attendant. That's been the lingo over the years. 40 years at Continental Airlines. You can evacuate a plane in 90 seconds. I admire that skill. That's amazing. I fly all the time. I love flying.
Good.
And you're trained to deliver a baby in flight. Those are Those are
Yeah.
excellent skills to have.
Yeah.
So tell me the process of going from Continental to MAC operations, which is transporting the military men and women to Vietnam from 1969 to 1971.
Right. Had I gone with any other airline, I never would have been able to have been senior enough to fly the MAC operations. But with Continental, all you had to do was come off of your probation, which I had passed, and then you sign up, and I signed up. And we had to go through instructions on not deplaning in Vietnam. We had to go through all the shots that all the military received. We had to receive the same ones. And so I was ready. I was ready to do it because I didn't want to join the military, but I wanted to help. And so this was my way to serve.
So during that time, did you have when you get on a MAC flight, do you have military status even though you're a civilian?
Yes, actually we did. But you have to understand now, the government contracted all carriers in the United States. So every carrier that operated in the United States was contracted by the government to do this, to transport the troops, because one airline could not have done it at all. Yeah. So, starting out with Continental, I was able to get out there and sign up and do it. Where with American or United, you had to have 10 years before you could hold it. Everything's by seniority with the airlines from the get-go. When you start in the training, whoever's the oldest in the class is the senior one.
Right.
So, yeah. So that, seniority is very important with the airlines.
So BJ, you were close in age to the boys that you were transporting over. I mean, you weren't a fully formed adult, for lack of a better description. You were still a very young person.
Right.
And that's a huge responsibility that you had.
Yeah. I when I go around and speak, I always talk about my very first flight into Vietnam, because it was very emotional for me. And so that's one of the things that I do, try to talk about so that people can get an idea of what we went through. Those flights were very long, and you had to be young to do them. You could not have been older to do the long hauls that there were. And the restrictions were totally different than they are today. Today, we're entitled to have a rest, whether you can sleep or just have a rest. Whereas back then, we had no regulations.
So you had to stay up the flight had to be what, 15, 16 hours? And then
well, it depends. First Continental only operated out of the West Coast. So we would go to all the different bases, air bases, military bases, empty out of LA, pick up 165 soldiers. And we had we flew then the 707 320 series. They had seating for 165, and we always filled up. We never left or went with an empty seat, and no divider as well. So we'd pick up the troops, and the first leg would be from the West Coast, wherever it was, over to Hawaii. And we would get off the aircraft in Hawaii, and the soldiers, of course, would remain with the aircraft. And, that very first time, I had no idea what I was doing or signing up for. I just knew I was taking these troops, to Vietnam. But flight time for me, was all new. So the 5.5-hour flight to Hawaii went fairly well.
Oh, sure.
And of course, the troops, they were just out of boot camp. They were young, 18, 19-year-olds. So really at 24, I was old.
Yeah.
Compared to them. And most of the flight attendants that were with me were all younger. I was one of the older ones. So anyway, but with 18 and 19-year-olds, they look more like my brothers, and that's kind of how it all began. And we ended up staying 3 days in Hawaii. And I thought to myself, okay, I think these MAC trips are going to be all right, because the 9 months that I flew domestic, I always got sick on turbulence. So I would be in the lavatory kind of throwing up. And so I always try to say to people, I didn't eat right. Didn't take vitamins, didn't know about sleeping, how important sleeping was. So I had to learn all those things the hard way.
Right.
And so then when the call came out of Hawaii, it was going to be the Philippines. And of course, I had no idea how long the flight was, but it's 11 and a half hour flight time.
Mhm.
And, those aircrafts, we had no movies, we had no stereo, no cell phones, you had 165 soldiers and four of us female air hostesses, stewardess. They called us Mac Stews by then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and so we did the best on those flights, serving them meals, beverages. And the very first flight, it didn't really, I was still so nervous and wanting to take good care of them. But then later I learned during those long flights is when we did fun things
Mhm.
with them. But then once we landed in the Philippines, they stayed on with the aircraft and we, of course, got off. And we had a wonderful hotel in the Philippines. It was right outside of Clark Air Force Base. And anyway, they took really good care of us. And we never knew when we were there how many days we would be there. So when we packed from these flights, the MAC flights, we would pack for a 6 to an 8 day trip.
Okay.
And
Mhm.
sometimes they would be longer. And of course, we'd have to do some laundry somewhere along the line, to make it back home. So the Philippines was great. I loved it. And then when the call came for me, the first flight into Vietnam was going to be Tan Son Nhut, which is Saigon. We flew into Saigon, Tan Son Nhut, Cam Ranh Bay, Da Nang, and Bien Hoa. Those were the four places that we flew into. And I thought, well, okay, this is what I signed up for. I'm okay with this. And so, of course, picking up the military guys out of the Philippines to go to Saigon was about a 3 hour flight time, a little more. And we served a meal, and it was a very somber flight. And I can tell you, each leg they changed.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it was very obvious. By the time we got to Vietnam, their whole demeanor was totally different. And then that first flight landing in Vietnam brought tears to my eyes. And I didn't want anybody to see me cry, so I went up into the flight deck, but cockpit then, and let myself cry. And I had a little talk with myself. I said, if you're going to do these flights, you can't cry ever again. And so that was the beginning. I share, beginning of 2 year commitment. The company only wanted us to sign up for 1 year. And we couldn't understand why. And it wasn't until after I got off that I realized, that I suffered my own PTSD during
Yes.
that time, hearing
Exactly
stories.
what I was going to ask you about. Now, you had mentioned in the book also that there were times when you flew dignitaries. Did they get special treatment on the plane, or it was an
Well,
even playing field for everybody?
they got to sit up at the very front row.
Okay.
And so, of course, if you were the senior flight attendant, you got to sit in front of them and talk to
Right.
them.
Right.
And that was very interesting, meeting different commanders, generals. Every now and then we would have a dignitary that was special. And believe me, the guys on the airplane behaved very well. Not that they didn't any other time, they
Right.
did. They were gentlemen, especially the Marines. They were kind of our favorites. But
Yeah.
anyway, they behaved well.
So, you made this flight in and out of Vietnam a lot. All right. And
Yes.
it became, I'm sure you became senior, where you were relied upon. And were you always afraid upon landing? Like, what were the logistics and the operations of that? Or did you just get used to it same way you land anywhere else? It had to be a different feeling going into Vietnam.
Most of the time, we felt safe. We loved our pilots. If our
Mhm.
pilots were going to land an aircraft or take off, no matter what the situation is, we put our whole trust in them.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
so landing and takeoff, for me, the landing I wasn't so concerned about, but the takeoffs were. I just kind of held back my cheers. All of them cheered every time we took off out of
Mhm.
Vietnam, and rightly so, rightly so. But even when the gears went up, I still held my breath And then when climbed a little bit higher, then I felt safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was all the time.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm, so the base where you were landing the planes to bring the soldiers and also to bring them home
Mhm.
had a base hospital attached to it?
Oh, yes.
Yes. So you talk about you brought the extra cookies, brownies, and milk off the flight to the men in the hospital. Tell me about that.
Well, that was real special. It was not my idea. I learned everything from the flight attendants ahead of me,
Okay.
what they did.
Mhm.
But we served brownies and a carton of milk to all the soldiers on our meal going into the Philippines. We never told them. But when we picked up the trays, if they did not open up their milk carton or the brownies, we would put them in little shopping bags and save those. And then when we landed in the Philippines, that mainly was the hospital we went to
Oh,
visit.
okay. Mhm.
Yeah, because in Vietnam we had to stay real close to the
Yeah.
aircraft.
Yeah.
We were told never to deplane, but that went by the wayside
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
So we saved these brownies and cartons of milk, and when the van would pick us up from the Philippines, the airport, we'd ask them to drop us off at the hospital, and then we would just go room to room and deliver these, talk briefly to the soldiers. I wrote about one particular soldier that I remember, and I remember a lot of them, but this one
Mhm.
was
Mhm.
definitely close to my heart. He had a curtain wrapped around him, curtain, so
Mhm.
you had to push the curtain away to get in there. And so from the outside of the curtain, I said, "Knock, knock." I said, "May I come in?" And he said, "You may not want to." And I said, "I'm okay if you're okay." And no silence. So I pushed back the curtain. I saw this strong, big soldier laying in the hospital bed, and his right side had been blown open.
Mm.
And I could see a lot. So I didn't want to look at it. I just looked at his eyes and just smiled and said, "How you doing? How you doing, soldier?" And he said, "I'm doing good." And so we just talked briefly, and then I left. And so he's real close in my heart. I always hoped while I traveled around speaking at all the veteran posts or chapters that I might someday run into him, but I know for sure I'll see him in heaven. So
Absolutely. I can imagine that feeling that comes over to you every time you're around the soldiers. Two of the stories that you included in your book are your brother's service in Vietnam, and it was maybe one or two cousins. How worried were you when it hit home that your brother was in Vietnam serving and you saw him there? You met up with him.
yes, he was stationed in Cameron Bay, and he told me that he worked in the hospital in administration and that I never had to worry about him. So, on our approach into Cameron Bay, I'd have our captain call the tower and let them know, "Hey, we've got Bob Elliott's sister on our flight." And so he'd leave the hospital and come over. And I saw him briefly for about 10 minutes, and that was precious.
Mhm.
Uh, it's funny. I was worried about him, and he was worried about me. From both of us, we were worried about our safety, and so I was able to see him 3 times.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah,
Okay.
that was pretty special. Pretty special. And he's home and he's doing well. He's done well. Yes, he's had some physical problems, but incredibly doing well.
That's
Yeah.
so wonderful here.
Mhm.
BJ, you vividly described, I almost couldn't sleep after reading the book. And I went through it twice already because
Aw.
it's so beautifully written. Tell Linda that too as well. It's just beautiful. But you described the soldiers who had finished their tour and boarded the plane just as is, dirty, torn uniforms. Some even had Agent Orange dust on them
Mhm.
and bandaged up with injuries or a sling. Did they
Mhm.
share your experiences with, like, on the flight back to the United States? I know they cheered and clapped and were thrilled to leave, I'm sure. In the all that time that you spent with them, did they share with you what had gone on, or were they silent about it?
Yes, many of them did, but let me just clarify. When they would get on, some of them were only given like 40, 45 minutes when they came back from the jungle or wherever they were at,
Wow.
to grab
Wow.
their duffel bag and get out to the airplane. So that was why we may have had some,
Yeah.
not all of them, but
Mhm.
some of them
Okay.
who just came out of the jungle. But most of them had taken a shower, were clean, and
Okay.
got on. So
Okay.
we just, so there was just a little bit of that.
Okay. Okay.
And then as far, yeah, they many of them spoke very freely to us. You know, I think the most conversations that we've had were about their units and how many in their units were killed and didn't make it. Some half, he was the only one. I mean, those were very touching moments, you know. Other than that, they didn't really share deeply about
Hmm.
all what they had gone through. A lot of them just slept on the flights back, and we totally understood that. And I think you may have read in there where the only way we wanted to wake them up was put perfume on us and walk to the
Yes.
cabin
Yes.
before we served our meals.
Yeah.
We didn't want to
Yeah.
get on the PA and,
Yeah. Just
make a,
jar them and
yeah,
yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We
Yeah.
we treated them really kindly. We were
Hmm.
very careful with them, and I hope that they knew that. Um, Especially when I went back to domestic flying, all of us. There's thousands of us, Mac stewardess
Okay.
back then, thousands of us, and when we would get a soldier on our domestic flight, oh my gosh, there wasn't anything we wouldn't do for them. Especially if they wanted a drink. We
Yeah.
we we would give them a drink and put it in a paper cup.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know.
Make
Yeah.
sure they were taken care of. Absolutely.
Mhm.
So and the other question I had for you. So it seems like some had a little bit of time to pull themselves together before they left. But I'd imagine most of them just couldn't wait to get out of there.
Oh,
Did the
right.
soldiers have a place to stop off, clear their head, decompress a little bit before they went back to their families? I mean,
Uh,
did they have a stopover before they got to the United States to, yeah.
yes, I knew that when we picked them up out of Vietnam and went to Okinawa, that some of them were able to, settle down or settle into civilian. But really, I think they were only given about 3 days there.
Okay.
Was not enough.
Mhm.
After writing my book and going around and speaking and seeing how many of them came back home and then experiencing PTSD. And like myself, I didn't even know either until, years later, uh, the emotions that I had suppressed during those years.
Yeah, and that was, I was exactly what I was going to ask you, that you talked about having to hide your tears and be positive, and you had to be the not only the pretty face, the smart face, the friendly face, to give them some comfort going and coming. So obviously you developed your own PTSD. Talk to me a little bit about, a little later, we're gonna talk about how you are reaching out now and you're visiting VFW halls and groups.
Mhm.
So what was the years right after that like for you? You talked about you were a party girl. Everybody's a party girl when they're a young girl and a flight attendant and single, especially newly single.
Yes.
Onto a hippie, then a woman of faith, as you say, a crazy love for Jesus.
Mhm.
So tell me about that trajectory, because was there one defining moment in this that made you write the book?
I'd always wanted to write the book, but let me just share with you the coping mechanism that we all did out there was we drank a lot and we partied, and of course, being single, we could date the soldiers or
Uh-huh.
pilots,
Uh-huh.
and so that part of my life kind of helped. You got used to going in there. You got used to bringing out soldiers. It just became, like not normal, but it just became a routine. And I think the drinking showed me years later it was just the mechanism to cope with. And
Uh-huh.
after I knew I had to get off the Mac flights, my body was I was burning the candle at both ends. And I think we all can admit to that. You know, we
Sure.
partied, we flying those long hours. I mean, that all just has an effect on you.
Sure.
But so when I got off, my life hadn't changed domestic. It was an adjustment, definitely an adjustment. Here I was surrounded by soldiers for 2 years, going on the bases, you know, and dating a lot of them. And then when you change to domestic, you have the suits and the women in the dresses, and you're serving them, and it's like, wait a minute, everybody's acting so normal, and they're reading their newspapers. They could have cared less about the soldiers over there in Vietnam. And that was a disturbing part for me. And you do need a transition. I think everyone does. Even when you're changing jobs or moving, you have to give yourself time to adjust and get used to that. So at that time when I came off, I was still partying and I was still drinking. And now, of course, the 70s, drugs had been introduced to me, social drugs. And so I was invited to a party in Manhattan Beach in California. And when I walked into the house, they had everything that you would want to take. No alcohol, just all the rest were drugs. And I looked around and I said, this is not where I want to be. So I picked up my purse and I walked out of that house, and I took my shoes off and walked down to the beach. And my parents are deaf. And I think I share that in my book in the very beginning. And so we didn't go to church. I knew nothing about God. I know I had a grandmother that prayed, and she was Catholic, but still, I didn't really know. So when I walked down that beach, and it just like everything just kind of let out. You would have thought 5 years of being a flight attendant and having all these parties and all these boyfriends would be fulfilling, and it wasn't. It wasn't. And that moment came for me when I walked down the beach, and I looked up and I said, God, are you real? And he did. He shared and showed me how real he is. And so that turned my life around totally. And that was the first thing I wanted to do when I got back home, was to go look and buy a Bible. But I didn't buy a hardback. I just bought a paperback, you know, Good News for Modern Man, and read that. And when I read that and saw who God was, you know, and his son and the Holy Spirit. And so that changed my life. And that was 50 years ago this year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So what did you do career-wise? Did you stay flying at that time, or did you leave as well? Yeah. No, you stayed flying, right?
I did. I love being a flight attendant. I really did. I like to serve. I like to help. And in those 40 years, actually, I had no aircraft incidences, but I sure did have a lot of physical people that, you know, I had to do CPR twice, choking. I almost did deliver a baby.
Oh,
20 minutes, you know, for delivering that baby, but a lot of medical. So I love flying.
Now, did you have a little later, did you have Vietnam vets getting on the planes at all? Did you encounter some of these men who, now that their service was over, on the flights? Did you, or were people not talking about it?
No. Even a businessman. I remember one flight, you know, y'all have to sit up with your seatbelt on for landing.
Right.
And we have to go through and make sure you're all doing that. And this gentleman was laying down, and he didn't have his seatbelt on. So I reached in, because he had the whole 3 rows. So I reached in and tapped him on his shoulder. And when he woke up, he started to go for my throat.
Oh, for you.
Yeah. And I knew right then, Vietnam. I said, and I calmed him down. I said, it's okay. It's okay. You're all right. You're on an airplane. And then he calmed down. He felt so bad. I said, I understand, you know. So no, most of them did not talk about it, especially if they were in civilian clothes. And even now, you know, when I wanted to write that book, and like I said, I always wanted to, And then after I retired, my mom and my stepdad came to live with us, and that was a blessing, and that was quite a while. And then after they passed away, Linda, my co-writer, she's in the medical field, but she loves to write. She
Mhm.
writes beautifully. And I said, well, I have the stories. Will you help me write? And that's how we started. And it was a process.
Yeah.
And I was at my high school reunion. And when I asked how many of my classmates had gone to Vietnam, and when they raised their hands, I walked up to them and I said, would you share your story with me? And that's how it began.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's how it began. And so one story led to another story to another. And every time I meet them and ask if they would share their story, it's like they're kind of taken back. But yes, they talk about it. They're able to share as much as they can,
Hmm.
but there's that PTSD part of them that they don't want to share, and they kind of hold it down like it's going to go away. And PTSD does not go away. You have to really deal with it. And that's my new goal right now is writing, sharing how you can be healed. And eating right and sleeping right are all part of it. So
All of it. Yep.
I'm
All,
right in
yes.
there, with you.
Uh-huh.
But yeah,
Yeah.
so uh, yeah,
So you've done a tremendous thing by sharing these stories, and it will help, and encourage us to remember, respect the service that these soldiers gave in honor
yes,
of their country, regardless of what we were told, regardless of popular opinion. So my question to you is, because you were there, do you think the movies and books and information about the Vietnam era that's out is accurate? And do you have any one in particular movie or book that you recommend that's more accurate than others? Because Hollywood always likes to sensationalize. I'm curious.
right.
Yeah.
What? Ken Burns. Oh, Ken Burns. Yeah, my co-writer's
Did you
name,
did
Ken
you did you
Burns.
did you like that series?
The
Okay.
documentary. Oh my
Yes.
gosh, yes, that was a great
Yeah.
documentary. But our mutual friend Susan,
Oh,
this
Susan's amazing. Yeah.
this book is a great book, and I would highly recommend it.
Mm.
She's able, uh, through these letters that her mother wrote to the veterans over there. It's very touching, very honest, very open. Um, so I'd recommend that. And I would say, yes, I have seen a lot of books. A lot of them are technical. A
Yes.
lot of them are about their squadron. Yes, there are many good books out there. I like going and speaking at schools.
Hmm.
I like to be able to explain, not getting into politics, but
Yeah.
explaining the war to the younger generation, high schools as well as college. I had an incident with my finger. I ran a pair of scissors through it, so I had to go to an emergency clinic, and as they're sewing me up, I just asked them if they knew anything about Vietnam. No, they don't. So, my heart says, well, I'll leave a book for him just to read. Um, you know, it's a void in many societies and many
Yes,
groups.
yes,
So,
yes. Yeah, it's not part of the history lesson that they should be learning. And
right.
so you put up Susan's book and I'm going to put up your book.
Thank
This book is again beautifully written by a beautiful lady behind my wings,
you.
BJ Elliot Prior.
Thank
BJ,
you.
is your current husband a Vietnam veteran?
No, he is not. He was given notice and he went to his boss and gave his boss said, I'm out of here in 2 weeks. But the 2 weeks came and he was not called.
Okay.
So, but he supports me because I'm very involved. I like being involved with the veterans. I like going and speaking to them and I've learned so much. So he's a big support, as well as Linda, my co-writer, who knew nothing about the Vietnam War, but enjoyed writing it with me.
And
So,
you know what, BJ, I think there's still so many stories to be told.
oh yes,
There's still so much more information. And I think the men that were on the younger side, I fear, the lifespan in our country is unfortunately still in the 70s and people are living longer through good lifestyle choices. But
hmm
there are elders now the baby boomers are the elders. The World War II veterans are almost gone. And
Yes.
so I can't say enough about more movies, more books, more television shows, more documentaries.
Good
You know,
for you.
keep that ball rolling. You know, Susan, I think,
Okay.
is coming out with a documentary, Susan Hunter of 77 Letters. And
Mhm.
so I encourage you to keep this going, maybe a volume 2.
Yeah, I mean,
Amazing.
I do. I'm so happy. I never would have thought I would have been so involved with
Mhm.
veterans when
Mhm.
I flew those trips,
Yeah.
50 plus years ago. But I'm very happy too. And if there was time left, I would tell you some special stories that have been shared with me. But
Please, why don't you want to pick one? You want to give me a quick one story that you could
okay.
share?
Uh,
Yeah.
I went to Dallas and spoke at a large VFW. And after I was finished, I had a Marine come up to me and said, he handed me his card, his phone number. He said, I need to tell you my story. And I said, okay, good. So the next day, when I got home, he called me. And my co-writer was walking into the house at the same time. And I asked her to record because I knew it was going to be
Mhm.
pretty powerful. And he said that when he came back from Vietnam, he was a mess. Alcohol, the works. He was a mess. And I don't know from what period or how long that was, but he said that he did turn his life over to God and he joined an AA. And so he still goes to the AA here in Dallas. And they were at a meeting. He said it's not a very big meeting, but he said we meet every week. And this younger kid came in. When I say younger, I think he's 70 and this maybe 50s, 55.
Okay.
And he had a ponytail with earrings on. And this Marine telling me the story, his name is Bob, just kind of rolled his eyes, you know. So the young kid came in, sat down. Then during the meeting, he stood up and he said, I drove all the way over 2 hours from Longview to Dallas. I've been sober 6 months, but I came here to get drunk for the whole week. And he says, but I saw your door. And obviously, AA has a special sign on their
Right.
door.
Right.
And he said, I knew I needed to be here. And so he said, I came in and that's where I'm at. Of course, they all,
Mhm.
right thing, good, you know. So then after they finish, they go and eat together. And so they go to the little cafe they go to and they pull all their tables together because they don't know how many are going to show up.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
everybody was seated except for one seat was empty, sitting across from Bob that's telling me the story. And so in comes walking that young man. And Bob says, I just said a little prayer. I said, Lord, help me be kind. You know, so he comes in, sits down in front of him, and Bob's got his Marine jacket on.
Mhm.
And so this young kid goes, oh, so you're a Marine, huh? And Bob says, no, I just like wearing military stuff. And they all laugh, you know. And before he sat down, the young kid said, my dad was a Marine, but he was killed in Vietnam. So now, of course, Bob is, you know, feeling it. And so he sat down and a little conversation. And so then Bob asked him, he says, do you know anything about your dad? And he goes, no, it was 1965. I was a baby. I was told he jumped off of helicopters and jumped off of submarines. That's what Bob did. And so he said to the young man, he said, tell me your full name again. And he did. And Bob said, was your dad's first name Shelton? And the young boy said, yes. And he said, your dad died in my arms. And Bob's saying,
Wow.
you can't tell me there's no God. 50 plus years ago, his dad dies in my arm. This kid is in Longview and comes to where I go to AA.
Right.
He said, you know, God had his cross. And so he said they've become,
Mhm.
you know,
That's an
and
amazing story. It's
yeah,
an
help them.
amazing, amazing
But
story.
they tell me a lot of stories,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's what I have. And so when I can, I like to share them. So
Absolutely
thank you for
beautiful,
letting me share
beautiful,
that.
beautiful.
Yeah.
BJ, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And this was so informative. And let's keep this going. I want to ask you, what do you like about getting older?
Actually, I'm in good health.
Yeah.
I was very sickly as a child. My parents were poor, and really, food we ate was not healthy.
Right.
So when I went into my 20s, and then I was sick on the airplane, I realized I needed to eat well. And the first health book that I read was Adele Davis.
Yes, yes.
Well, I can't think of it right now, but that was the first book. That was the first time I read about nutrition.
Mhm.
So from that point, I've always been on vitamins. I know how important it is to eat healthy
Mhm.
and the right amount of sleep. And so, I'm going to be 80 this year.
Wow.
And
Well,
I feel very
yeah.
good. I feel very blessed and healthy. So I thank him. He's
Mhm.
the one that, gives me that peace inside of me. And I have a good husband. So anyway,
Wonderful.
yeah, I recommend to everybody how to eat right, live
Mhm.
right. I think
There
that was,
you go.
yeah.
There you go. Thank you again so much. And
You're
thank you all for
welcome.
joining us here. Thank you for listening. I'm Patricia Greenberg. Please subscribe to my channel for more information on eating well, living well, and aging well. And for questions, comments, and suggestions, please contact me at www.patriciagreenberg.com. Thank you. Thank you, BJ.
You're welcome.